Chicago O'Hare Airport buzzed with life on a typical Friday morning. Travelers rushed between gates, announcements echoed overhead, and the aroma of coffee drifted through the air. Amid the chaos, Andrew Thompson strode through the crowd, his polished leather shoes clicking against the tiled floor. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly, and a gold watch gleamed on his wrist, broadcasting his wealth and success. But behind the veneer of perfection lay a hollow man. At 45, Andrew was a self-made millionaire, admired by many but lonely in ways no amount of money could fix. His private jet sat on standby, yet he was here, mingling with the masses, heading toward another mundane business trip. As he checked his watch for the third time, something unusual caught his eye. A woman with chestnut brown hair walked past him, holding the hand of a boy no older than 10. Andrew froze mid-step. The woman's profile was strikingly familiar. Her posture, her walk, even the tilt of her head. It couldn't be, he thought, his heart thudding in his chest. But when she turned slightly, her face erased all doubt. "Sarah," Andrew whispered, his voice barely audible amid the noise. His ex-wife. But it wasn't just her presence that left him breathless. It was the boy at her side. The child's unruly blonde hair, sharp green eyes, and even the way he moved sent a chill down Andrew's spine. It was as if he was staring into a mirror of his younger self. Memories hit him like a tidal wave. 10 years ago, he had left Sarah in the dead of night, abandoning their modest life together. Ambition had lured him away, and he hadn't looked back. Not once. But now, as guilt clawed at his chest, a terrifying thought surfaced. Had she been pregnant when I left? Desperation overtook him. Andrew moved through the crowd, his expensive briefcase forgotten at his side. "Sarah!" he called out, his voice louder this time, trembling with urgency. She didn't hear him, or pretended not to. The boy tugged at her hand, and they disappeared into the throng of travelers. Panic surged through Andrew as he pushed past people, his mind racing. Was that his son? Had he abandoned a family he didn't even know existed? 10 years earlier, Andrew Thompson was a different man. Back then, he wasn't the millionaire striding through airports with a gold watch and tailored suit. He was a young entrepreneur, barely scraping by but fueled by relentless ambition. His days were spent chasing business opportunities, his nights brainstorming ways to escape mediocrity. Sarah, his wife, was his anchor. A schoolteacher with a kind heart and an unwavering belief in him, she provided a balance to his restless energy. Their modest apartment was filled with laughter, homemade meals, and dreams that didn't require wealth to thrive. But Andrew wanted more. Much more. "Why can't you just be happy with what we have?" Sarah asked one night, her voice tinged with frustration. She had just returned from work, her hands still dusted with chalk. Andrew barely looked up from his laptop. "Because what we have isn't enough," he replied coldly, the words cutting deeper than he intended. Sarah sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It's enough for me, Andrew. It's enough for us." But it wasn't enough for him. He dreamed of high-rises, private jets, and gala dinners with the elite. Each day spent in their small apartment felt like a prison. Then Vanessa appeared, a storm in his already turbulent world. Andrew met her at a networking event in New York, a gathering he almost skipped because of an argument with Sarah. Vanessa exuded confidence. Her sleek designer dress, sharp wit, and unapologetic ambition captivated Andrew instantly. "You're wasting your potential," Vanessa told him over cocktails. "With the right connections, you could have everything you want. You deserve more, Andrew." Her words echoed in his mind long after the event. He began to see Sarah's questions and their modest life as obstacles. Vanessa, on the other hand, represented opportunity, freedom, and the power he craved. Their meetings became frequent. Business trips turned into excuses to see her. She encouraged him, fueled his desire for wealth, and painted a picture of a life that seemed within reach if only he'd let go of his current one. The breaking point came on a crisp autumn night. Sarah had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from grading papers. Andrew sat at the kitchen table, staring at her peaceful face. A wave of guilt hit him, but it wasn't strong enough to outweigh his ambition. He scribbled a note on a piece of paper, the words colder than he intended. "Sarah, I can't do this anymore. I need more from life than you can give me. Please don't try to find me. Andrew." With shaking hands, he packed a small bag and walked out the door without looking back. As he drove into the night, his chest felt heavy, but the city skyline ahead filled him with hope. He convinced himself he was doing the right thing, that he was destined for greatness, and Sarah would be better off without him. What he didn't know was that Sarah would wake up days later to the discovery of her pregnancy, alone, devastated, and unsure how to move forward. Andrew, blinded by ambition, had no idea he was leaving behind more than just his wife. He was abandoning a future he would come to regret. Andrew sat in the back of a Chicago taxi, the city lights blurring as the car sped through traffic. His fingers gripped his phone tightly. He'd made the call, something he never imagined himself doing. "Frank, it's Andrew. I need your help," he had said to his old friend, a seasoned private detective. Now, as the taxi approached Frank's office, Andrew's mind raced. The image of Sarah and the boy at the airport haunted him. He needed answers, even if they shattered the fragile balance of his carefully curated life. Frank greeted him with his usual gruffness. "This is a mess you're diving into, Andrew," he said, motioning him inside. "I know," Andrew admitted, his voice unsteady. "But I need to find them. I need to know the truth." Frank leaned back, studying him. "You sure you're ready for what you might find?" "I don't have a choice," Andrew said. Over the following days, Frank pieced together the trail of Andrew's past. Sarah's name resurfaced in public records, tied to a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. When Frank finally delivered the report, Andrew sat in stunned silence. "She lives in the same area," Frank said, "still teaching, and she has a son, Ethan, 10 years old." The words hit Andrew like a punch. 10 years. The boy he had seen at the airport was undoubtedly his son. His chest tightened with guilt. Ethan had grown up without a father because of him, but Frank wasn't finished. "There's one more thing. Sarah's been seeing someone. A guy named Mark. They've been together for a couple of years now." Andrew's stomach twisted. He barely heard Frank's next words, his mind consumed by images of another man filling the role he had abandoned. The next morning, Andrew found himself parked a few houses down from the address Frank had given him. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he stared at the modest home. A swing hung in the front yard, and a bicycle leaned against the porch. The scene was almost picturesque, a perfect family life that no longer included him. As if on cue, the door opened. Sarah stepped out, her hair catching the sunlight. Behind her, Ethan bounded down the steps, his laughter ringing out as Mark followed, carrying a school backpack. Andrew's heart clenched. They looked so happy. Ethan's face glowed with joy as Mark tousled his hair, a natural fatherly gesture. Andrew felt a wave of emotions, regret, anger, and an unfamiliar sense of longing. This was the life he could have had, a life he had willingly walked away from. He remained in his car, watching from a distance. Every moment felt like a dagger to his chest, but he couldn't turn away. When they drove off, Andrew sat frozen, the reality of his mistakes weighing heavier than ever. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just searching for Sarah and Ethan. He was searching for a way to undo the damage he had caused, to rewrite a chapter of his life that had been filled with selfishness and ambition. But as he started his car and drove away, he couldn't ignore the truth. Sarah had moved on, and Ethan already had someone who filled the space Andrew had left behind. The night Andrew left, Sarah's world shattered. She awoke to the echo of silence in their tiny apartment, expecting to find him working late at the kitchen table. Instead, she found his note. Cold. Final. Devastating. Her hands trembled as she read the words over and over, hoping they would change. But they didn't. Andrew was gone. In the days that followed, she moved through her life like a ghost, her mind numb with disbelief. She called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Friends offered their sympathy, but their pity only deepened the ache. Then, just as she began to pick up the pieces of her life, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The pregnancy test felt like both a lifeline and a chain. She sat on the cold bathroom floor, clutching it in disbelief. Tears streamed down her face, not just from the shock, but from the overwhelming fear of facing the future alone. The months that followed were a battle. Morning sickness, unpaid bills, and the crushing weight of loneliness became her constant companions. She fought to keep her job as a teacher, even as her growing belly made standing for hours in the classroom a struggle. By the time Ethan was born, Sarah was exhausted but resolute. When she held him for the first time, the world seemed to pause. His tiny hands gripped her finger, and she felt a fierce determination rise within her. She would be everything he needed, no matter the cost. The early years were tough. Ethan's laughter brought joy to their small home, but every time she looked at him, she saw Andrew. The same green eyes, the same mischievous smile. It was as if Andrew's ghost lived in their son, a constant reminder of what had been lost. But Sarah refused to let the past consume her. Slowly, she built a stable life for Ethan. She took on extra tutoring jobs to make ends meet, and their small home became a sanctuary filled with love, even if it lacked luxury. Then, Mark entered their lives. It started with a chance meeting at a school fundraiser. Mark, a kind and easygoing man, worked as a carpenter. His gentle smile and warm demeanor put Sarah at ease. Over time, he became a steady presence, showing up with coffee on tough mornings or offering to fix broken things around the house. Mark never pushed. He respected the walls Sarah had built around her heart, patiently waiting for her to let him in. And when she did, he embraced both her and Ethan without hesitation. For Ethan, Mark was a hero. They spent hours playing catch in the yard or building intricate model planes at the kitchen table. Mark treated Ethan as his own, filling the void Andrew had left behind. But for Sarah, the resemblance Ethan bore to Andrew never faded. Some nights, as she watched Ethan sleep, the past came rushing back. She would sit by his bedside, stroking his hair, wondering if Andrew ever thought about them, if he regretted walking away. Despite the love and stability Mark brought, Sarah's heart remained divided. She couldn't fully escape the shadow of her past. And when she saw Andrew at the airport that day, her carefully constructed world trembled. The man she had once loved, the man who had broken her, was back, and she had no idea what that would mean for her or her son. Andrew sat in his car, parked a few houses down from Sarah's. His heart pounded as he stared at the modest home. He had spent days parked here, watching from afar, too afraid to act. But tonight, the weight of guilt and longing had become unbearable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the street in an amber glow, Sarah stepped out onto the porch. She was watering the flowers that lined her front yard, her movements calm and unhurried. Andrew's chest tightened. She looked just as he remembered, strong, beautiful, and entirely out of reach. Summoning his courage, Andrew stepped out of the car and crossed the street. Each step felt heavier than the last. When Sarah finally noticed him, the watering can slipped from her hand, splashing water onto the ground. "Andrew?" she whispered, her voice laced with disbelief and anger. "Sarah," he began, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her tone sharp now. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing with fury. "After all these years, what could you possibly want?" Andrew faltered, his rehearsed words vanishing. I saw you at the airport. And the boy, Ethan. He looks just like me." Sarah's jaw tightened, and she folded her arms protectively across her chest. "You don't get to do this," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "You don't get to waltz back into our lives and pretend you care." "I didn't know," Andrew said, desperation creeping into his voice. "If I had known—" "What?" Sarah cut him off, her words like knives. "You would have stayed? Don't lie to yourself, Andrew. You left because you wanted more, and you didn't care who you hurt in the process." Andrew took a step closer, his hands trembling. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But please, Sarah, let me meet him. Let me explain. Explain what? Sarah's voice rose, attracting the attention of a few curious neighbors. That you abandoned us? That you chose your ambition over your family? Ethan doesn't need you, Andrew. He has a good life. He has a family. As if on cue, a car pulled into the driveway. Mark stepped out, his brow furrowed as he took in the tense scene. Everything okay? Mark asked, his voice steady but protective. He walked to Sarah's side, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Andrew felt a pang of jealousy at the sight. I'm Andrew, he said, his voice low. Ethan's father. Mark's expression hardened. You mean the man who walked out on them? That's enough, Mark, Sarah said sharply, though her voice wavered. Mark didn't back down. Sarah and Ethan have been through enough. They don't need this, you, bringing chaos into their lives. I'm not here to hurt anyone, Andrew said, his voice filled with regret. I need a chance to make things right. Sarah took a shaky breath, her eyes filled with unshed tears. Ethan is your son, she said finally, the words heavy with emotion. But you don't get to disrupt his life. He doesn't know who you are, and I plan to keep it that way. Andrew's heart shattered at her words, but before he could respond, Sarah turned to Mark. Let's go inside. Mark placed a protective arm around her as they walked back to the house, leaving Andrew standing alone in the fading light. The door shut behind them, and Andrew felt the weight of his mistakes more deeply than ever. The family he had once dreamed of reclaiming was slipping further out of reach. But deep down, he knew he couldn't give up. Not yet. The tension in the small living room was suffocating. Sarah sat across from Ethan, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. Her son's curious green eyes, so much like Andrew's, searched her face for answers. Ethan, she began softly, her voice shaking. There's something I need to tell you. Ethan tilted his head, confused by her sudden seriousness. What is it, Mom? Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. Do you remember asking me about your father? Why he's not here? Ethan nodded, his innocent curiosity giving way to unease. Well, your father came back, Sarah said, her words measured and heavy. What? Ethan's brow furrowed. He's alive? He's here? Yes, Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He was at the airport, and he wants to see you. Ethan stared at her, his expression unreadable. But as the weight of her words sank in, confusion turned to anger. Why now? Where has he been all these years? Sarah reached for his hand, but Ethan pulled away, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He left us, didn't he? He demanded. He didn't want me, did he? No, Ethan, it's not like that, Sarah said, her voice pleading. He made mistakes, but he didn't know about you. He didn't... Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. That doesn't make it okay, he shouted. He left you. He left us. What kind of father does that? Sarah's heart broke as she watched the anger and hurt spill out of her son. He's trying to make things right now, she said gently. But it's up to you, Ethan. You don't have to meet him if you don't want to. Ethan shook his head, tears streaming down his cheeks. I don't want to meet him. He's a coward. The words hit Andrew like a punch to the gut when Sarah told him later that evening. They were standing on the sidewalk outside her home, her voice a mix of sadness and resolve. He said he doesn't want to see you, Sarah said. He called you a coward. Andrew's throat tightened. He's right, he said, his voice raw. I was a coward. But I want to fix this, Sarah. I want to be part of his life. Do you even understand what you're asking? Sarah snapped, her own frustration bubbling to the surface. You left me to raise him alone. Do you know how hard it was? How many nights I stayed awake wondering how to make it through? Andrew hung his head, the weight of his guilt nearly unbearable. I can't change the past, he said quietly, but I can try to be better now. In the days that followed, Andrew tried to connect with Ethan, but his attempts were met with silence. He sent letters, left small gifts on the porch, and even lingered near the schoolyard just to catch a glimpse of his son. Ethan, however, remained guarded. Each time he saw Andrew, he turned away, his young heart refusing to trust the man who had caused his mother so much pain. For Andrew, the rejection was agonizing. Watching Ethan walk away felt like losing him all over again. Yet, he couldn't blame his son. He had left a wound in Ethan's life, and now he had to accept the consequences of his own choices. But deep inside, Andrew resolved that he wouldn't give up. No matter how long it took, he would fight to earn Ethan's forgiveness and the right to be his father. Vanessa's furious voice echoed through her sprawling mansion. She threw the newspaper across the room, the bold headline screaming, "Wealthy businessman Andrew Thompson abandons luxurious life for mysterious family ties." "Unbelievable," she spat, pacing the marble floor. "After everything I did for him." Her anger boiled over into calculation. Vanessa had built her life around power and control, and she wasn't about to let Andrew walk away unscathed. With a cold, determined smile, she picked up the phone. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice icy, "leak everything. Every questionable deal, every bribe, leave no stone unturned. It's time the world sees the real Andrew Thompson." The fallout was swift and brutal. Within days, Andrew's once thriving business empire crumbled. News outlets uncovered years of unethical practices, and reporters camped outside his properties, eager for a statement. But the chaos didn't end there. Paparazzi found their way to Sarah's quiet neighborhood, snapping photos of her and Ethan as they left the house. The peaceful life Sarah had built was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. "Mom, why are there cameras?" Ethan asked one morning, his voice trembling. Sarah pulled him close, shielding him as they hurried back inside. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just stay inside, okay?" Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls from strangers, reporters, and even former acquaintances seeking gossip. The pressure was overwhelming. Meanwhile, Andrew sat in his empty office, staring at the reports of his ruined reputation. He could barely breathe under the weight of it all. His empire was gone, his wealth frozen, and his future uncertain. But for the first time in years, he felt clarity. He had spent his life running from responsibility, chasing ambition at any cost. Now, there was nowhere to run. He picked up the phone. "This is Andrew Thompson," he said firmly. "I'd like to confess to past financial misconduct. Please connect me with the authorities." Andrew's decision to turn himself in shocked the world. Cameras captured him walking into the courthouse, his head held high despite the jeers of the crowd. Inside, he answered every question with honesty, sparing no detail about his illegal activities. The gavel fell, sentencing Andrew to 2 years in prison. He accepted it without complaint, knowing it was the price he had to pay. While Andrew sat in his stark prison cell, a small miracle began to unfold. After weeks of silence, Ethan finally agreed to visit him. The first visit was awkward. Ethan sat stiffly across from Andrew, his gaze fixed on the table. "Why did you do it?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with anger. "Why did you leave us?" Andrew's throat tightened. "I was selfish," he admitted. "I thought I needed more than the life I had. But I was wrong. I've regretted it every day since." Ethan didn't reply, but the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Over time, their visits grew warmer. Ethan began sharing bits about his life, his favorite classes, his love for soccer. And Andrew, for the first time, felt like a father. As Andrew worked to repair his bond with Ethan, Sarah made her own decision. She and Mark sat on the porch one evening, the chaos of the past weeks finally settling. "I can't do this alone anymore," Sarah said, her voice soft. "You're not alone," Mark replied, taking her hand. "You never were." Tears filled her eyes as she leaned into him. "I love you," she said, "and I want us to be a family, for Ethan." Mark smiled, pulling out a small velvet box. "Then let's make it official." On a bright spring day, Sarah and Mark exchanged vows in a simple ceremony. Ethan stood proudly beside them, holding the rings. From his prison cell, Andrew received photos of the wedding. There was a pang of sadness, but it was overshadowed by gratitude. Sarah and Ethan had found stability and love, and Andrew had begun to find peace. The road to redemption was far from over, but Andrew was ready to walk it, one step at a time. The day Andrew Thompson stepped out of prison, the world seemed brighter, cleaner, and quieter than he remembered. He took a deep breath of fresh air, the weight of his past mistakes still present, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. He was a free man, not just from his physical confinement, but from the lies and ambition that had once consumed him. Determined to rebuild his life, Andrew used the business acumen he had honed over decades for a new purpose. He partnered with a non-profit organization dedicated to helping struggling small businesses. Offering free consultation and mentorship, Andrew became a lifeline for entrepreneurs who faced the challenges he once knew all too well. Meanwhile, Sarah and Mark had settled into their new life as a married couple. The chaos of Andrew's financial scandal had faded, and their home was once again a haven of stability for Ethan. Yet, as much as Sarah appreciated Mark's unwavering support, she noticed the growing bond between Ethan and Andrew. At first, Ethan's visits to see Andrew after his release were cautious and infrequent, but with time, they became more natural. Andrew didn't push. Instead, he listened, letting Ethan share his world at his own pace. One afternoon at the park, Andrew watched Ethan kick a soccer ball around with a group of friends. As Ethan ran over for a water break, Andrew handed him a bottle. "You've got a great left foot," Andrew said with a smile. "Thanks," Ethan replied, wiping his brow. He hesitated, then added, "Mark helped me practice a lot." Andrew nodded, a bittersweet feeling in his chest. "He's a good man. You're lucky to have him." Ethan looked at him thoughtfully. "Yeah, but I think I'm lucky to have you too." The words hit Andrew like a wave. He blinked quickly, swallowing the lump in his throat. "That means more than you know, Ethan." As the months turned into a year, a delicate but functional co-parenting arrangement formed between Sarah, Mark, and Andrew. Ethan's best interests always came first, and while there were occasional tensions, the adults worked together to ensure he felt loved and supported. Mark, though initially wary of Andrew's involvement, eventually came to respect the man's efforts. "You've changed," Mark told him one evening after a school event. "For Ethan's sake, I'm glad." "I'll never stop trying to be better," Andrew replied. The day of Ethan's science fair was one of those moments Andrew thought he'd never experience. The school auditorium buzzed with excitement as students presented their projects to proud parents. Standing near Ethan's booth, Andrew, Sarah, and Mark watched as he explained his experiment to the judges. Ethan glanced at them, his green eyes shining with pride, and gave a small wave. "You've done a great job raising him," Andrew said to Sarah quietly. "We all have," Sarah replied, her tone soft but steady. In that moment, Andrew felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. This was his second chance, not the lavish life he had once chased, but something far more valuable. As the event ended and the crowd dispersed, Andrew walked to his modest car, glancing back to see Sarah and Mark laughing with Ethan. He smiled, knowing they were his family too, in their own unconventional way. Under the evening sky, Andrew silently vowed to live a life of integrity and love, cherishing every moment he had been given to make things right. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was the beginning of a better story, a story of redemption, forgiveness, and hope. What did you feel while reading this story? Did Andrew's journey of redemption, Sarah's resilience, or Ethan's struggle touch your heart? If you were in their shoes, what choices would you make? If you had to rate this story, what score would you give it? Take a moment to reflect and share your thoughts. Your comments and feedback are not just words. They're a way for me to grow, improve, and craft even better stories that resonate with you. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt tales. Each story is a journey, and I'm here to bring you along for every step. Thank you for taking the time to experience this story with me. Wishing you a wonderful day filled with hope, joy, and a touch of inspiration.